Joey Coron.
Good morning. As you all know, I have the jitters, so I have to walk. I hope you don't mind, Luz. You spoke to me last week about that. How was your weekend? Happy resurrection to all of us, right? I hope everybody was able to rest. And so we begin our study today. You will all recall that the book of Galatians is all about Paul's defense of the gospel. If you will leave from this room and know nothing other than that, I'll be happy. It is that Paul is defending the gospel. In chapter 1, he does that by establishing his authority. In chapter 2, we studied that last week, we know that Paul went to the church in Jerusalem to defend his gospel. And there, we understood that salvation is by grace alone, through faith alone. Okay? Chapter 2 ended with the sufficiency of Jesus' death on the cross. Okay? So in chapter 3, he continues his defense of the gospel. But this time, for purposes of easy understanding, the verses in chapter 3 will be divided into several portions, the first of which is by Paul going back to the experience of the Galatians. Second, he defends the gospel by using Abraham, the life of Abraham as an example. Third, he will go right to it and explain why the law cannot save. And fourth, he goes back again to the life of Abraham and how Abraham got saved. And fifth, he will explain the purpose of the law. And so we will proceed following this outline. Again, ladies, let us be reminded that it is not the law, but faith that saves. And faith is sufficient. Okay, let's go now to verse 1. Many commentaries have said that Paul was the prime mover in founding the church in Galatia. Having said that, he opens verse 1 saying, "O you foolish Galatians." You know, for all intents and purposes, he could have ended in chapter 2. He could have ended there because he explained the gospel sufficiently. It is by grace alone, through faith alone. And they could have all went their separate ways. Paul would have been able to continue with his journey. The church in Galatia knew the true gospel, and they could have all been off. But Paul continues with chapter 3. And what he's saying is, no, I'm not yet finished. Let me explain this further. And the idea there is, and why I said that, he was instrumental in the founding of the church. Imagine your kids. Imagine your kids coming to you and telling you, "Mom, I think we need to do good works to be saved." You will be shocked, wouldn't you, with that new heresy that your child is pronouncing. It is the same emotion that Paul brings forth in verse 1. He is shocked, he is baffled, he is perplexed, and he is emotional. It is like a kid, a parent speaking to a kid who is suddenly believing in a heresy. And in verse 1, he says, "You of all people, wasn't the gospel so clearly presented to you? Did I not vividly portray the death of Christ on the cross? So much so that it was as if you were there. As if you personally witnessed the death of Christ and the sufficiency of that. And believing in that saves you. Why are you now adding no to the equation? Who bewitched you?" He says in verse 1. You know, the term bewitched there is like an evil eye. And you know what an evil eye is? It casts a spell. Okay? Sa Tagalog, parang, sinong nanloko sa'yo? At bakit ka nanloko? Okay? In the time of the writing of Galatians 3, this is the Greco-Roman time. A lot of commentators have said that sorcery was quite prevalent at the time. So much so that in verse 5, in chapter 5, Paul enumerates sorcery as one of the deeds of the flesh. And we know sorcery to include magic, the occult, and witchcraft. And I won't go further into that, but I will say that that is the effect. That is the effect that it had in the church in Galatia. It was to sow confusion, and it was to sow doubt. Okay? They were so doubtful and so confused that Paul says, "You fools." In another version of this, I read another person who said, "You idiots. How could you have turned away from the gospel?" Okay? As we know, the Christian life is lived by faith. There is no room for the law. No room whatsoever. If you believe, you will be saved. The way Paul approaches the church in Galatia is he asks for rhetorical questions. What are rhetorical questions? Rhetorical questions are questions that don't necessarily demand an answer, sometimes because the answer is obvious, and sometimes the speaker wants to make a point. And in these 4 questions, 3 up there, in verse 2, Paul asks, "Marisa, when you received the Holy Spirit, when you were indwelt by the Holy Spirit, when you were born again, were you doing something? Were you performing a good deed? Were you being circumcised? Were you offering a burnt offering? Or was the gospel being shared to you? And in hearing, you believed?" That is Paul's first argument in his first rhetorical question. When you became born again, were you doing something? Were you performing an act? Or was the gospel shared to you? And did you believe in that? And as a result of that, you were indwelt by the Holy Spirit and you became saved? Of course, the answer is no, right? They believed by faith. Now, the work of the Holy Spirit. The work of the Holy Spirit in saving you. Did you need to add to that in verse 3? Is there anything you need to add in God saving you? And the answer again is no. The indwelling of the Holy Spirit is entirely the work of God. The opening of your eyes to the gospel, the opening of your ears, the opening of your understanding to the gospel is all God's work. You had no participation there. Okay? And Paul rounds out the rhetorical questions by asking in verse 5, is it not God who did all this? Who chose you? Again, were you doing something when you were saved? Did you contribute anything to that? Paul says no, right? The church in Galatia, they say no. It was entirely God's work. The summary answer to all these rhetorical questions is that the answer is we believe by faith, not by acts, not by following law, not by being circumcised, not by offering a burnt sacrifice. You believe because you heard, and you heard with faith. Now here's a quick exercise for all of us. If we say we live our Christian life by works, it means we blank on our own blank. We depend on our own merit. Okay? On the other hand, if we say that we live our Christian life by faith, it means that we depend on what Christ has done for us and what he continues to do for us. Now let's go back. You know, ladies, do you recall the time when you became born again? And I think for most of us, it is a time when the gospel was shared to us, right? It is that single moment in time in your adult life that is quite outstanding, right? You cannot forget it, you cannot deny it, right? For me, I'd like to share my experience now. I remember that there was someone who tried to share the gospel with me several times. And the first few times, I had a few questions and I just kept quiet about it. But I remember that moment, that precise moment in time. And really what happened here was the Spirit indwelt me. There was nothing I did, but God, in his goodness, allowed the Holy Spirit to enter me. And because of that, I understood the gospel. I understood what it means. I understood all its implications. I had no questions. But at the same time, a lot of things were happening. I was repenting of my sin. I was accepting God. Such a marvelous experience that I feel many dimensions of my being were responding to it, you know, morally, spiritually, intellectually, emotionally. I was beginning to understand God and accepting him. And now, the second batch, the second method by which Paul argues is he uses the example of Abraham, okay? Earlier, he used the example of the Galatians. And what do I mean by that? He went back to their experience, right? How did you become born again? Did you do anything? Were you performing works? This time, Paul uses the example of Abraham. And who is Abraham? Abraham is the greatest patriarch we know in the Bible, correct? He is the father of Israel. And what do we find in verse 6? Abraham believed, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Ladies, did they have to do anything in order to be saved? Nothing, correct? Abraham believed in God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Now, if our greatest father, Abraham, was saved through believing, what more us? Okay? In verse 7, we know that if we believe